Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Diana Kramer. I serve as the Executive Chief of Staff here in the Office of the President at Hostos Community College, and it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you all to this third and final installment for the spring semester of our Black at Hostos Town Hall series. Today, we have an incredibly special speaker joining us with a tremendous presentation on Juneteenth and its origins. And known to so many of you as its now second Independence Day and newest federal holiday, I will leave all of the details for our guests to share with you all. And before we do so, I'd like to introduce our president, Dr. Daisy Coco de Filippis, for her remarks.
Bueno, good afternoon. Muy buenas tardes. Welcome to the latest in our town hall series, Black at Hostos. Today, we'll be examining the origins of Juneteenth, a celebration of Black freedom, history, and progress with a lengthy and fascinating history. Juneteenth observations began in the 1860s in Texas, and Professor Taylor will correct me if I'm mistaken in any way, and spread across the country and reach a new level of official recognition in 2021 when President Biden declared Juneteenth a federal holiday. Professor Kathy Taylor of Naugatuck Valley Community College will be our guide to all things Juneteenth. I came to know and love and greatly admire Professor Taylor during my years as president of Naugatuck. Highly regarded for her work as a professor of legal studies, the students follow her like a Pied Piper everywhere, and for her deep commitment to the communities NVCC serves. She has really served the college with distinction in whatever. And Kathy, let me tell you, I put upon her multiple different responsibilities and initiatives that she carried on beautifully and then went on to the next task. So I am gonna tell you, this is a real pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague to this virtual forum, and welcome all of you, my dear colleagues. And I see some students as well. So bienvenidos. And Kathy, it's all yours.
Good afternoon. It is really wonderful to be back with you all. Here in Connecticut at Naugatuck Valley Community College, I walk our campus and I see Daisy's handprint everywhere. I see her in the garden, I see her in the artwork, I see her in the sculptures, I see her in our student common area. And so it is so nice to see you in person, albeit on Zoom. But it is very nice to see you. So thank you, President Daisy, for the invitation, Diana Kramer, and also Victor for just handling all of the logistics, and always to the students for really being the impetus behind this series and how important it is for students to advocate, and then also when institutions respond. So I am so thankful to be here. As we prepare to celebrate Juneteenth, a federal holiday celebrated this year on June 19th, 2022, it's a good time to look back. Juneteenth is our first federal holiday since Martin Luther King Day in 1983, so it's been some time. And it commemorates the end of slavery in Texas, nearly 2 years after Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. As much as Juneteenth represents freedom, it also represents how emancipation was tragically delayed for enslaved people in the deepest reaches of our Confederacy. So I'll begin to share my screen with you all now. And when we think about that legacy of freedom being long delayed, and thinking about how long it took for news of freedom to reach Texas, it's important that we begin with that historical context. What was happening before and after the Civil War? What took freedom so long and the continued legacy of Juneteenth? Here you have an artist rendering of the night of December 31st, 1862. Enslaved and free African Americans gathered, many in secret, to ring in the new year and await news that the Emancipation Proclamation had taken effect. Just a few months earlier, on September 22nd, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued the executive order that declared enslaved people in the rebelling Confederate States legally free. However, the decree would not take effect until the clock struck midnight at the start of the new year. This occasion, known as Watch Night Service, which is still held in many Black churches throughout the country today, or Freedom's Eve, marks when African Americans across the country watched and waited for news of freedom. Today also, Watch Night is an annual New Year's Eve tradition that includes the memory of slavery and freedom, reflections on faith, and the celebration of community and strength and resiliency. And yet we know that the future has a past, and it's important to know the context in which historical events took place. For this, we turn to our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, who was perplexed by what to do about the peculiar institution known as American slavery. No wonder people were waiting and watching for freedom. Slavery having existed since 1619, by the 1850s, the country was still struggling with what to do. And we see up close Lincoln's struggle as well. Let's turn to his words and the questions he would ponder about this peculiar institution of slavery. Lincoln ponders what can be done about slavery itself. What should be done about slavery? These are two very different questions. What should be done and what can be done. In this speech that many historians claim resurrected Lincoln's political career, in 1854, Lincoln explained his objections to the extension of slavery into new states joining the Union. In his 1854 speech in Illinois, Lincoln attacked the morality of slavery itself. This was 6 years before the start of the Civil War. Lincoln argued that enslaved people were people, not animals, and consequently possessed certain natural rights. He said slavery is founded in the selfishness of man's nature. Yet, noting its immorality is different from knowing what to do about it. Here we have a long quote from Lincoln where he really struggles in terms of what to do with slavery. And I'll read it. When Southern people tell us they are no more responsible for slavery than we, I acknowledge the fact. When it is said that the institution exists and that it is very difficult to get rid of in any satisfactory way, I can understand. I surely will not blame them for not doing what I should not know how to do myself. If all earthly power were given me, I should not know what to do as to the existing institution. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land. But a moment's reflection would convince me that whatever of high hope there may be in this, in the long run, its sudden execution is impossible. What then? Free them all and keep them among us as underlings? Is it quite certain that this betters their condition? I think I would not hold one in slavery at any rate. Yet the point is not clear enough for me to denounce people upon. What next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this. And if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of white people will not. We cannot then make them equals. It does seem to me that systems of gradual emancipation might be adopted. From this, we can see his struggle. Lincoln offers to send the enslaved population to Liberia. Then he says, well, should we free the enslaved and make them equals? He rejects both, and he argues for this gradual emancipation. Despite Lincoln's struggle with slavery, it is clear that the enslaved population wanted freedom. And here we have Dred and Harriet Scott. Often we only hear of Dred Scott and we don't hear of Harriet Scott. But both took their fortune into their own hands in 1846 and came to an old courthouse to seek freedom from enslavement. Dred Scott was about 50 years old when the case started. He was born into slavery in Virginia around 1799 as property of the Peter Blow family. The Blow family then moved to St. Louis in 1830, taking Dred Scott with them, and soon they sold him because of the family's financial problems. Dr. John Emerson, a military surgeon, purchased Scott, and Scott went with him to Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was prohibited by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. During this period, Scott married Harriet Robinson, who was also enslaved. They had 2 children. John Emerson married Irene Sanford during their brief stay in Louisiana. Here in 1842, the Scotts returned with Dr. Emerson to St. Louis, where Dr. Emerson died that following year. Mrs. Emerson continued to hire out Dred Scott and Harriet Scott and their 2 children to work for other families, keeping their wages. On August 6, 1846, Dred Scott and his wife Harriet Scott filed suit against Irene Emerson for their freedom, arguing that they had been to free territory and was therefore free. So often, we only hear about Dred Scott. And I know it's important to remember the role of women in this fight for freedom. So I just want to take a moment to say her name, Harriet Scott. In 1857, 11 years after Dred and Harriet Scott first filed suit, the Supreme Court decided the case. And with their judgment ruling that no African American was entitled to citizenship, it hastened the Civil War. And what is perhaps one of the most infamous cases in its history, the Supreme Court decided that all people of African descent, slaves as well as those who were free, could never become citizens of the United States and therefore could not sue in federal court. The court also ruled that the federal government did not have the power to prohibit slavery in its territories. The Scots remained enslaved. The decision of the court was read in May of 1857. Chief Justice, who was a staunch supporter of slavery, wrote the majority opinion for the court, where he said, and actually asked the question, is a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves entitled to sue as a citizen in the courts of the United States? The Chief Justice held that the answer to this question was no. Even if Dred Scott was a free man, the court held that he could not be a citizen. It stated that because Scott was Black, he was not a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. Just as a side note, because so often we see legal cases and we can sometimes forget that it's real people behind them. Peter Blow's sons, childhood friends of Dred Scott, helped pay their legal fees throughout all of those years, the 11 years. After the Supreme Court decision, the sons purchased Dred Scott, his wife, and their 2 children and set them free. Unfortunately, Dred Scott died 9 months later, yet the groundwork was already laid. The country had to address this issue of slavery. And again, I turn to the language of the Dred Scott decision, for it clearly sets forth the country's view of the enslaved. Let's look at the Chief Justice's words. And here we have it. Here we have the beginning. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Chief Justice goes on to say, the general words above quoted would seem to embrace the whole human family. And if they were used in a similar instrument at this time, would be so understood. But it is too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included and form no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. For if the language as understood in that day would embrace them, the conduct of the distinguished men who framed the Declaration of Independence would have been utterly inconsistent with the principles they asserted. And instead of the sympathy of mankind, they would have deserved our universal rebuke. But history shows they had, for more than a century, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and unfit associates for the white race, either socially or politically, and had no rights which white men are bound to respect. And the Black man might be reduced to slavery and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise. That is difficult to read. It may be difficult to hear because the language is very clear. What the Chief Justice is asserting is that the framers, in writing the Declaration of Independence, did not mean to include the whole human race. If they did, and yet allowed slavery, our distinguished and honored founding fathers would be objects worthy of our disdain. And we would certainly not have that. That's essentially the Chief Justice's argument. And in reading this, I hope you hear, this is part of the legacy of Juneteenth. I hope you hear the current objections raised in 2020, raised in 2021, raised in 2022 to critical race theory. And how dare educators teach history and show framers to be anything other than God-fearing men who love their country. This is still with us today, and this is a part of the legacy. While the decision of Dred Scott was well received by slaveholders in the South, many Northerners were outraged. The decision greatly influenced the nomination of Abraham Lincoln to the Republican Party and his subsequent election, which in turn led to the South seceding from the Union. Here we have a quote by Frederick Douglass. And it comes 2 months after the Dred Scott decision. And he's constantly being asked in terms of, what do you think about the Dred Scott decision? How awful is this Dred Scott decision? And he says, my answer, and no thanks to the slave-holding wing of the Supreme Court, my hopes were never brighter than now. We are now told in tones of lofty exhortation that the day is lost, all lost, and that we might as well give up the struggle. The highest authority has spoken. The voice of the Supreme Court has gone out over the troubled waves of the national conscience, saying, peace, be still. The Supreme Court of the United States is not the only power in this world. It is very great, but the Supreme Court of the Almighty is greater. Just 2 months after this Dred Scott decision, we have his brilliance and his moral outrage with the decision of Dred Scott, maintaining that slaves are not within the provisions and the protections of the Constitution of the United States. In fact, he goes on to say, and the decision goes on to say, that slaves are property in the same sense that horses, sheep, and swine are property. That colored persons of African descent have no rights that white men are bound to respect. Douglass, despite the court's ruling, is calling the country to hope, to continue to fight for the abolishment of slavery. And he argues that the call will be answered, for it is just and it is sanctioned and required by God, the Supreme Court of the Almighty. There is a clear tension between the states that would treat people as property, akin to horses and sheep, and another part of the country that does not want to see the expansion of slavery into new territories, and by those who see slavery or saw slavery as a moral failing of the country. That's a tension that's very difficult to reconcile. And so we can see how the Dred Scott decision pushes the country closer to civil war. Here we see a map of both free and slave states in 1860. Almost from the beginning of his administration, abolitionists and radical Republicans pressured Abraham Lincoln to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. Although Lincoln personally hated slavery, he felt limited by his constitutional authority as president to challenge slavery, and thought that he only had power to do anything about slavery in the context of any necessary war measures. He also worried about the reactions of those in the loyal border states where slavery was still legal. Lincoln is said to have summed up the importance of keeping the border states in the Union by saying that, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. This map illustrates which states and territories of the United States allowed slavery and which did not in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. The slaveholding border states included Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. All of these states, except Virginia, were exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation. Now that we have a map of slaveholding and free states and the importance of border states to the Union because of their location to rivers and streams, their natural resources, their proximity to DC and New York, we can see how important they were to keep in the Union. But it is also very important to debunk one myth about Lincoln that many refer to as the Great Emancipator. So during his presidential campaign in 1860, Lincoln was strongly supported by the abolitionist movement, as I said earlier, and their voices were growing stronger and stronger. They had cause for optimism by the time Lincoln took office in 1861 as the first Republican president and a candidate whose platform or the party platform had been anti-slavery. Lincoln had always thought slavery an injustice. However, he did not consider himself an abolitionist. His aim was to prevent the extension of slavery to new territories in the West. Those Southerners clearly saw Lincoln as a man on a mission to end slavery, which in turn would destroy the Southern economy and the social order. For his election as president, the large majority of his winning votes came from the North and West. But in 10 of the 15 Southern slave states, there was not one single ballot cast for Lincoln. Out of 996 counties in all Southern states, he was victorious in only 2. South Carolina had already become the first state to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860, quickly followed in January and February by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Some of these states may seem familiar because some of these same states are states that are passing voting rights restrictions currently. Virginia joined the Confederacy in April after the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. In May, it's followed by Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, setting up the Civil War battle between the Union and the Confederacy. Here we have a quick timeline, and it's really important to remember Lincoln's words about the struggle of what to do with slavery. And from this, we see that Lincoln is still being pragmatic. In 1861, he argues that he wants to save the Union, that he does not intend to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. Despite that, we have the start of the Civil War a little more than a month later. A little more than a year later, we have a letter and that was published in the New York Tribune. And so here, Lincoln again is saying, I don't have any legal right nor inclination to interfere with the institution of slavery. He tells us that his primary goal is to save the Union. So it's very important to remember Lincoln's words in terms of what they were in the beginning and ultimately what they became as the war progressed. And so it's very important to remember that the Emancipation did not declare free all enslaved persons in the United States. Remember, those that were enslaved in the border states that remained loyal to the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to those border states. So just as I noted in the observation of watch night services in 1862, the Civil War started on April 12, 1861. Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862, a whole 17 months after the start of the war. And again, remember, the slave-holding border states who remained loyal to the Union were exempt in the Emancipation Proclamation. He was very concerned, or the Emancipation Proclamation rather, was concerned about the states in rebellion to the Union. So Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation heading into the third year of a bloody civil war. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are free. Despite this expansive wording, the emancipation was limited in so many ways. But one of the things that we know about the border states and those that are enslaved in the border states continue to be enslaved. But also when we look at the language of the emancipation, we also know that the freedom that is promised is dependent upon the Union and the military being victorious. So let's take a look at the language of the Emancipation Proclamation itself. And it's a lot here. And I'm going to call your attention to that second paragraph. Here we have it that on the first day of January in the year 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people wherein shall then be in rebellion against the United States shall be then and forever free. Then he goes on to designate the states that are in rebellion against the United States. And so you can see Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except for 12 different parishes, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except West Virginia and 7 other counties. Although the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the nation, it captured the hearts and the minds and the imaginations of millions of Americans and fundamentally transformed the character of the war. After January 1st, every advance of federal troops expanded the domain of freedom. The great abolitionist Frederick Douglass called the Emancipation Proclamations the nation's regeneration. The pointed and keen observation by Douglass that the Emancipation Proclamation was but the first step could not have been more accurate. Although the Emancipation Proclamation would not free slaves in areas where the United States could not enforce the proclamation, it sent a very mighty message and signal both to the enslaved and to the Confederacy that enslavement would no longer be tolerated. It sent a message also to Great Britain and France that support for the Confederacy was support for slavery. And an important part of that signal was the invitation to those enslaved to take up arms and participate in the fight for their own freedom. Still, as the Civil War begins, Blacks in northern cities are literally begging to join the Union Army and are soundly rejected at every turn. A group of Black men in Boston passed a resolution seeking enlistment. They wrote, our feelings urge us to say to our countrymen that we are ready to stand by and defend our government as the equals of its white defenders, to do so with our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor for the sake of freedom and as good citizens. In September 1862, Black volunteers in Cincinnati, Ohio, sought to join the Army through the formation of local units called Home Guards, only to really get the wrath of the city's police chief, as well as the Ohio governor, who said, "Do you know that this is a white man's government? That the white men are able to defend and protect it, and that to enlist a Negro soldier would be to drive every white man out of the service." Despite this, almost 200,000 Black soldiers enlisted. And it's doubtful that anyone today can fully appreciate the enormity of that moment and the rush of the emotion for the 4 million people whose destruction of an institution was a very affront to the humanity that gave new life and hope to long suffering in a land predicated on freedom and justice for all. The Emancipation Proclamation, the document itself, barely 700 words in length. For the students, they know that's about a page and a half. But it carried moral, political, religious, and military meaning. And it is really still revered as one of the most dynamic documents in world history. And yet its reading was delayed for so many. Imagine that. The Emancipation Proclamation is issued on January 1st, 1863, freeing all those enslaved in rebellion states. Texas was a rebellious state, and Texas simply did not learn about it. The enslaved in Texas did not learn about it. When the war ends with Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendering on April 9th, 1865, the official news still did not reach Texas for weeks. It arrived on June 19th, 1865, the day we now celebrate as Juneteenth, when General Gordon Granger and Union forces landed in Galveston. They had arrived to occupy the state and to order the emancipation of all enslaved people in Texas. Texas was a safe haven for slaveholders because of the limited Union presence in the state. There were no major Civil War battles in Texas, so no opportunities for those enslaved to seek shelter behind Union lines. Slavery in Texas during the Civil War, was relatively unaffected. And with that knowledge, slaveholders started to move their slaves to Texas and reestablish their plantations. Here you can see sugarcane, which was a favorite crop in Texas, along with cotton. Both required labor, preferably free enslaved labor. The fear and uncertainty about emancipated slaves was evidenced in stories appearing in the Galveston newspaper, wondering about the white citizens' plight, economically and socially. And I quote, "under a government in which we have now no voice." Again, you will hear some echoes from today in Virginia, where a group of men gathered with "we will not be replaced." Again, another part of the legacy of Juneteenth. Another piece in the Galveston Weekly News in 1865 read, "This attempt to overthrow an institution that has become a part of our social system and which our entire population has believed essential to the welfare of both races, led to the war. And all we can do in our present entire dependence on the clemency of our conquerors is to repeat to them what we have been urging for so many years, that the attempt to set the Negro free from all restraint and make him politically the equal of the white man will be disastrous to the whole country and absolutely ruinous to the South. This is the mood that greeted the general and his troops. He was sent in to command the Department of Texas, and among his first duties was announcing General Order Number 3. And it reads, "The people are informed that accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor." One may ask, what in the world took so long for word to travel? And the answer is we simply do not know. But there are some theories floating around, and here they are. There are some historians that believe that a messenger was murdered on their way to Texas to read the order, and so that's why it was delayed. There's theories that the news was deliberately withheld by enslavers to keep the labor force on the plantation. Another theory is that federal troops actually waited for the slave owners to reap the benefits of one last cotton harvest before going to Texas to enforce the proclamation. No matter the reason, we know that people in Texas celebrated their freedom years after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's take a look at the language of Order Number 3, the order that we celebrate now as a federal holiday. And again, we can see tension present. Here we have the actual order that was read. I want to draw your attention to the last 2 lines. The freemen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere. Think about the real absurdity of the order. Be quiet, work for your wages, for the same slave master that fought a war to hold on to you and keep you as property. And please know that we better not find you idle anywhere. What we see is the desire clearly expressed in Order Number 3 of don't disturb the natural order of things. It goes back to Lincoln's, should we make the enslaved equal to us? And his answer comes back, no. These last 2 lines really are the beginning of the Black Codes. The Black Codes are ushered in right after the Civil War, where the newly emancipated are convicted of loitering and breaking curfew and vagrancy and not carrying proof of employment. Again, you can see some legacy of this in some of our current laws. The first Black Codes were passed in Georgia In 1865, the same year the Civil War ended, they were explicitly applied to Black people and subjected them to criminal prosecution and returned them to chains because they could be leased for profit. It almost reminds me of the New York policy that was in place and in place in many other places besides New York in terms of stop and frisk. Douglass, again, the great abolitionist, left us so many great speeches. I would invite you to read every last one of them. They are a treat. And he gives us this warning from 1865, the same year as the reading of Order 3 in Galveston, Texas. He lets us know that slavery has been fruitful in giving itself names. It's been called the peculiar institution, the social system, the impediment. It has been called by a great many names, and it will call itself by yet another name. And you and I and all of us had better wait and see what new form this old monster will assume and what new skin this old snake will come forth next. And so in this language, he reminds that we always need to be on the lookout for what skin that old snake of racism and oppression will come forth in. We may see it now in disparities in our educational system, in our funding for our educational system, in the sentencing in our criminal justice system, in the arrest rate of communities of color in our criminal justice system, the disparities in wealth, in the social determinants of health, in the voting rights bills looking to disfranchise or disenfranchise millions of people across the country, but particularly where the voter turnout rate has increased since 2008 in communities of color. Here we have the legacy of Juneteenth. Again, it is perfectly captured by Frederick Douglass. And I end where I started. The Dred Scott decision and Douglass's response to it. He wrote, "The Supreme Court has, in its day, done something better than make slave-holding decisions. It has laid down rules of interpretation which are in harmony with the true idea and object of law and freedom. It has told us, the Supreme Court that is, that the intention of legal instruments must prevail, and that this must be collected from its words. It has told us that language must be construed strictly in favor of liberty and justice. These rules are as old as law. They rise out of the very elements of law. It is to protect human rights and promote human welfare." He goes on to say, "Let us approach the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, we the people, not we the white people, not we the citizens or the legal voters, not we the privileged class, and excluding all other classes, but we the people, not we the horses and cattle, but we the people, the human inhabitants of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution." He closes with this. "And in conclusion, let me say, all I ask of the American people is that they live up to the Constitution, adopt its principles, and enforce its provisions." Douglass's words remain the spirit and the legacy of Juneteenth. The urging for America, these United States, to live up to its highest ideals as expressed in our founding documents. Despite Juneteenth being declared a holiday of significance, and this is the language in Texas when it was adopted as a state holiday in 1980, the language was a holiday of significance to the Blacks of Texas. I would argue that it is relevant to all of us, for Juneteenth stands as a reminder that despite the tension, despite the reality looking very different from the ideals, the legacy of Juneteenth is that freedom may be delayed, but it cannot be denied forever. In celebrating Juneteenth, let's make sure that we continue to fight for justice and freedom for all. As Douglas said, let us continue to ask of the American people that we live up to the Constitution, that we adopt its principles, and that we enforce its beautiful provisions. I thank you for listening, and I will gladly take any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Taylor. That was really quite something. And I'd love for everyone to open their cameras and take a moment to unmute and give a rousing round of applause for our tremendous presentation this afternoon. Please join me.
Thank you, thank you.
That was phenomenal. And as our audience here of nearly 40 members of the Hostos family, I'd like to thank everyone for committing their time to hear this powerful presentation. And more importantly, I'd like to recognize two members of our audience who are our former presenters of the Black at Hostos series, Professors Ana Maria Flores and Christopher Burrell. Thank you so much, faculty, for coming here to support fellow faculty members and for showing true collegiality. As you know, it's no easy feat to stand in front of an audience and similarly through Zoom to make sure that your words resonate. And so with that, I'd like to open the floor for Q&A, for questions, comments, any feedback really from anyone. So if you were moved or if you learned something new, or if you have a question for Professor Taylor on her work, please feel free to post your questions and we'll take them now. And I do have one that's come in, Professor, if you're ready.
I am, Diana. I just wanted to acknowledge a statement that was put in the chat in terms of the Supreme Court has a long history of upholding white supremacy, and essentially we just watch the nomination and the confirmation hearings for our latest Supreme Court justice. And oftentimes the senators, in questioning a candidate, will ask, what type of judicial philosophy do they have? And so when judges take a very originalist view, that is the same view that was taken by the court in Dred Scott to say that, well, the original intention at the time of the Constitution was to exclude those that were enslaved. So therefore, we are going to continue with that tradition. For the last 50 years, we have had a very, very conservative court that is only growing more conservative. And so some rights that have been won to Frederick Douglass's warning, we always have to be mindful, because currently, outside of abortion and many other issues also related to the LGBTQ plus community as well, and different rights that have been won. Now the court is taking up decisions and will issue decisions as it relates to affirmative action and considering race and emissions within higher education. They will take up in their next term in the fall, whether or not Miranda rights, if we watch Law and Order and the beginning of it, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you can say will be used against you in the court of law. Now the court is considering if that is a constitutional protection. And so we always have to be very, 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 very mindful and diligent.
Certainly. And in speaking to your point on the current climate, right, and the everyday attacks that continue on Black freedom and Black humanity, can you tell us a little bit about why Juneteenth may have taken a greater significance for Black Americans in recent years?
I certainly think that the Black Lives Matter movement, the onslaught of police involved shootings, this what many consider to be a racial awakening or a new awareness around the struggles within the Black community, and how so many policies that we have are not equitable and are downright discriminatory, and that lead to real disparate impacts in so many communities of color. And so when you think about what we see a little bit in May of 2020, we can remember the video of George Floyd being murdered. And we could watch that, and we could see that and think to ourselves and know, how does this exist? How do we have the words of our Constitution, we the people, forming a more perfect union, have a right to freedom and the pursuit of happiness, and yet see a man killed and have that video on rotation over and over again, and seeing this tension exist? At the same time, thinking about after President Obama won in 2008, and the Brennan Center for Justice has a wonderful site where they follow voting restrictions. There were so many regulations passed after Obama's election because the voter turnout in communities of color had increased. And so when we think about all of these things, it reminds us of Juneteenth. It reminds us that justice was delayed. And for the Emancipation Proclamation to come out, to be issued in 63, and for people in Texas to not receive word. And in fact, that when we think about that map, where some deeper South states and plantation owners are starting to move west to continue their plantations and slavery, you think about this tension and this duality that exists within America. And it existed in the founding documents, and it exists today.
Indeed, and I'm really glad that you've brought up how our elections and voter suppression are being threatened in a number of different ways, and how timely really the celebration and recognition of this holiday is, because I start to think of federal holidays that may have started to lose a little bit of their connection with our understandings of them, right? So like Labor Day comes to mind. I don't even think we know why we celebrate Labor Day anymore. People just know that they're not supposed to wear white after the holiday, and we get to go to cookouts and have a day off. And it's really, lovely to enjoy the good weather before, maybe the semester begins or school begins and other kinds of commitments. But I do think you bring up, you really nail it on the head when you talk about how timely it is, given the present crisis in our nation, and the recognition of Juneteenth. So I'd love to open the floor to folks who may have some questions or comments. And before I do so, I'd like to read a little bit from our chat. We have some wonderful messages from the audience, thanking you for your wonderful presentation, for how informative it was, and how many connections you brought out from your slides. Also, we have our president recognizing that you, as always, are a gift to your students and all of us who attended your powerful presentation. And Dean Gomez writes, thank you, Professor Taylor, for sharing your knowledge with us. It is more and more evident that we all have a responsibility to protect the rights of those that are constantly pushed back by the systems that we have in place in this country. For example, the escalation of police brutality when individuals voice their opinions, leading to forceful arrest, mass incarcerations, and/or death. We have an obligation in higher education to continue to empower others through education and opportunities, no matter the struggle or challenges that may be present.
Diana, I would add to that, and it really does go back to something that you said, that our holidays can begin to lose their significance, right? Memorial Day becomes a day to buy sheets or a mattress or whatever else. And with Dr. King's federal holiday, there's a day of service. And I would argue that Juneteenth needs to have something similar, that there is really a significance to holding fast to the warning of Douglas, because certainly we do not have the level of oppression that existed in 1860. But we certainly have oppression, and we certainly have more battles to fight. And this is certainly not a time to grow complacent.
Absolutely. If anything, and as the last few years have shown us, the reckoning has only just begun. People are using their voices, they're using their platforms to really make themselves heard. And I'd like to ask you if you think why some of this intensification is drawing interest from more younger people.
I think sometimes younger people can see what should be, or at least say, well, the Constitution says this, or the Declaration of Independence says this. So how is it that we have this? And we can point to many things that would be that this. And so oftentimes younger folks are able to see that in a different way than some of us who I am no longer in the young group. But we have seen it. And so we can sometimes grow complacent, or we can become frustrated, or where young people are arguing that this thing needs to change. And they have the courage to do something about it, because making change and speaking out about things, it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost. And so oftentimes we too have to count up the cost that will be incurred. And so it's a wonderful thing. If we think about young people and their involvement with the civil rights movement and sitting at counters and riding freedom buses, that's often done against the wishes of parents sometimes. And so the courage of young people, it gives me hope.
Absolutely, it does. And it's also manifested in certain ways, because even, they were so energized, I think, by the initial Black Lives Matter movement, that there was real momentum in Congress with, sweeping legislation such as eliminating those chokeholds and some of the tactics that the police use. I think chokeholds or strangleholds, whatever they were called, and that, giving them more clear protocols on how to intervene and, how to approach in their own departments on the use of unauthorized force. So certainly it's made some changes, if not yet substantial ones. But I'd love to hear more from the audience. Again, everyone is welcome. Please to open your cameras, open your microphones, ask questions. This is the only afternoon that we will have access to Professor Kathy Taylor. So please take advantage of this opportunity because this is not only a professor of legal studies, but also a co-chair of a center for racial dialogue and transformation. So this is really someone who's well-versed in this field and hosts a social justice series as well in Connecticut. So please, folks, feel free. Looks like we have enough.
Forgive me for not.
Please go ahead.
Camera. But I wanted to ask a question about perhaps connecting the Juneteenth, the sort of informing of freedom in Texas to the ratification of the 13th Amendment and sort of the loophole that was embedded within that amendment, similar to what you had said about the Black codes, and maybe this sort of kind of reaction in terms of freedom for more people, more African Americans, but also the efforts to curtail or to prescribe that freedom at the same time, both sort of legally and socially.
That's a really good question, Professor Burrell, because the 13th Amendment that essentially abolishes slavery has the loophole except for the conviction of a crime, and so that then almost allows a reinstitution. It brings in convict leasing. And so we have that loophole in the 13th Amendment, and even to bring it up today, when we think about May 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, the support for Black Lives Matter had increased exponentially after that video. And then shortly thereafter, there were calls to defund the police, and then just 18 months later, the New York Times has a follow-up where now support for Black Lives Matter has decreased, right? So it is constantly this push of, okay, you can go so far, and then the brakes are put on. And so even when we think about that language, that tension, so Chris brings up the 13th Amendment, right? And the loophole in the 13th Amendment. And we also see that tension in General Order 3 that's read at Galveston, Texas, to say, okay, you're free, but you need to stay where you are. You need to work for the same slave master you've been working, but now magically, it's going to be one of employee versus laborer, right? That's just magically going to happen. And if you choose not to stay, we better not find you idle, right? You better have something to do. You better be working. You better have employment papers, right? It's in the language itself. And so we are constantly seeing this tension that's happening. And so we really do. Thank you so much for that. The Netflix documentary, the 13th by Ava DuVernay, specifically talks about this loophole in the 13th Amendment and the different shape that it takes, and how much our criminal justice system and our prison population begins to expand after the 13th Amendment, and how the who is imprisoned begins to change after that 13th Amendment. And so there are just so many loopholes. If we think about Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which now held that separate but equal was unconstitutional. And so it called for the integration of schools, but within 20 years, the Supreme Court starts to back off of that decision. And it begins to give local control. Well, I would argue whenever you hear people talking about states' rights and local control, be very mindful, because often local control is a way to exclude people. And so even now, the way even though we had the Supreme Court decision from 1954, where I am in Waterbury, Connecticut, the Atlantic had a great piece, I want to say in August of 2019, that Waterbury is the most segregated school district in the country. That's in Connecticut, not Mississippi, not Alabama, not Texas, but in Connecticut. And so if we think about even the way we fund schools, how we decide what kids can go to certain schools, we have a very long history of residential segregation. And so if we have a long history of residential segregation, and now we assign kids to schools by where they live, then we know that those schools by definition are going to be segregated. They're just not going to be segregated because we told you to. Now it's going to be de facto, and the Supreme Court has said that they will not get involved in that. So I wish I could say I'm as hopeful as Frederick Douglass. I really try to cling on to that hope, but I'm getting very, very concerned.
Yes, we certainly do need to be better at playing the long game. That is a very good point. And in your words, I'm brought to mind of the recent election a few years ago in Georgia, the governor's race, and that complete disaster. And so I know we have another question in the audience. I'd love to turn it over to Ms. Idelsa Mendez.
No, thank you, Diana, and thank you, Professor Taylor. That was an amazing presentation. I just had a comment, and I sent you the message because I noticed that we were not allowed to open the camera. So that's why I sent you the message. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you. Forgive me.
I would just say I see a comment in terms of being labeled a criminal, right? We choose what we make to be a crime. So for someone not carrying papers, for that to be a crime, or to laugh too loudly, that to be a crime. All of those things will speak to this underlying tension in terms of Lincoln's first point. Are we to make them equal? And what would equal look like? And we see even now there is a huge concern. If we think about what is happening with critical race theory and what has happened with just school boards and going to school board meetings, and how always political, but certainly more political in recent years. And it is just a hesitancy, a downright hostility to teaching anything other than this very sanitized view that we have of history. When I teach constitutional law and I teach about Reconstruction, my students are constantly saying, why didn't I learn about this before? Why is this the first time I'm learning about this? And then we have to have conversations about what would have happened if federal troops were not withdrawn. One of the things that we see from the Emancipation Proclamation is that this hope of freedom was held on to by the military being able to get it to conquer and win territory in the Confederacy. As soon as you remove those soldiers, we knew what would happen. And effectively, that is what happened. And so we then had almost 100 years of Black codes and segregation and Jim Crow. And so many of these things are very predictable, very, very predictable, because if we know the history, and to the point about being labeled and the words we use, I serve on the college's ideal committee, and it's about inclusive, equitable academic leadership and practices. And one of the things that we're talking about now is, should we use the term academic probation? Could we have a different terminology for it? And thinking about how we use words, what they mean, and what they convey. So it's just a long list of all of the changes that we certainly need to make within higher ed.
I think you've given us some real food for thought with that one. And I'd like to recognize Idelsa's note earlier and just say, if anyone would like to use the raise your hand function, I can permit you to open your camera and speak if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question of our presenter.
Diana, I will just close with a thank you for coming to here. Hopefully when June 19th comes around, you will not use it as an opportunity to go to the mall, but that you will take it as an opportunity to really reflect and think about the cost of freedom and the continued fight to get America to really live up to those ideals, because we still have quite a ways to go.
Absolutely. And I echo your words and only add that for this coming June 19th, I hope everyone can honor the culture and also the achievements of all African Americans, so that we are really making sure that we are doing our best to recognize the holiday and celebrate it as it is intended. So thank you. Thank you so much once more, Professor Taylor. We thank you for coming all the way to the South Bronx from Connecticut this afternoon, even if it is virtually. We hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon and send you well wishes. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you all.